Did you know an army from Brazil fought in the mountains of Italy? Or that Mexico sent a squadron of fighter pilots to the Pacific? When we think about the Second World War, our minds usually go to a few key players. We picture the major powers of Europe, the United States, and Japan. Their stories are told in countless films and books. But the conflict was truly global. It reached into remote corners of the world, pulling in nations that we rarely, if ever, associate with the fighting. These countries were not just passive observers. They supplied critical resources. They provided strategic land for bases. They engaged in espionage. They sent their own people into combat. Their decisions, big and small, had real consequences on the war's direction and outcome. Why did a small, landlocked Asian nation provide 500,000 horses to the Soviet Union? How did a neutral country in Europe become a critical supplier of raw materials for the German war machine? What role did a tiny republic, completely surrounded by Italy, play? The standard history of the war is incomplete. It leaves out the stories of millions of people and dozens of nations. Looking at these lesser-known involvements shows a more complex and interconnected world. It reveals a global chess match where every piece, no matter how small, mattered. The choices made in Tehran, Dublin, or Buenos Aires rippled across the world, shaping the conflict in ways we are only now beginning to fully understand. Number 19, why did a nation of coffee growers send a snake-themed army to Europe? Brazil's story in the Second World War is one of a slow, reluctant turn from a complicated neutrality to active participation. For years, the country's leader, Getulio Vargas, played a delicate balancing game. His government, the Estado Novo, had features that resembled the authoritarian regimes in Europe. He maintained trade relationships with Germany, which was a major buyer of Brazilian cotton and coffee. At the same time, the United States, under its good neighbor policy, was trying to pull all of Latin America into its orbit and away from European influence. The situation was a geopolitical tug-of-war. German influence in Brazil was significant, not just in trade, but also through a large population of German immigrants. The U.S. countered with economic incentives and diplomatic pressure. For a while, Vargas managed to benefit from both sides. But as the war progressed, neutrality became impossible to maintain on the high seas. The breaking point came in 1942. Over a series of months, German and Italian submarines began targeting and sinking Brazilian merchant ships in the Atlantic. These attacks were not isolated incidents. They were a deliberate campaign. In August 1942 alone, 5 ships were sunk in 2 days, causing a massive public outcry across Brazil. The pressure on Vargas's government was immense. The choice was made for him. Brazil declared war on Germany and Italy. But declaring war is one thing, participating is another. There was a popular saying in Brazil at the time, it's more likely for a snake to smoke a pipe than for the Beth to go to the front. This phrase captured the widespread skepticism that Brazil would ever actually send troops to fight. In a defiant response, the Brazilian Expeditionary Force, or BEF, adopted a shoulder patch showing a green snake smoking a pipe. They became the Smoking Cobras. The force, numbering around 25,700 men and women, was trained and equipped by the United States. And they were sent to the one front where their contribution could be meaningful, the tough mountainous terrain of Italy. The Brazilian soldiers, mostly from tropical and subtropical climates, were thrown into a brutal European winter campaign. They fought under the command of the U.S. Fifth Army. Their most famous engagement was the Battle of Monte Castello. For months, Allied forces had been trying to dislodge heavily entrenched German defenders from a series of mountain strongholds. The Brazilians made several attempts to take Monte Castello and were pushed back with heavy losses. But in February 1945, in a coordinated assault, the Smoking Cobras finally captured the mountain. It was a hard-won victory that proved their mettle. The historian Frank D. McCann, in his book The Brazilian Expeditionary Force in World War II, details the immense challenges they faced, from the harsh weather to the difficult logistics. Beyond the BF, Brazil's contribution was vital. The country provided crucial raw materials, like rubber and quartz crystals, for the Allied war effort. More importantly, it granted the United States the use of air bases on its northeastern coast. The city of Natal became known as the trampoline to victory. It was the busiest airport in the world during the war. a critical refueling and transit point for aircraft, troops, and supplies flying from the Americas to North Africa and Europe. Without those bases, the logistics of the war in Africa and the Mediterranean would have been vastly more difficult for the Allies. Brazil's geography made it an unsinkable aircraft carrier in the South Atlantic. What hidden diplomatic cables between Washington and Rio de Janeiro reveal the true extent of the pressure applied to Vargas's government. How many German agents were actively working within the Brazilian government to try and keep the country neutral or even tilt it towards the Axis? What was the full unwritten story of the cultural and psychological shock experienced by young Brazilian soldiers when they were thrust into the middle of a European war? Number 18, how did a squadron of Aztec Eagles end up flying over the Philippines? Mexico, like Brazil, initially adopted a neutral stance. President Manuel Avila Camacho, who took office in 1940, had to navigate a complex domestic and international landscape, where Mexico had a history of tense relations with the United States, particularly over oil nationalization in 1938. However, the good neighbor policy had eased some of those tensions. Economically, Mexico was becoming more intertwined with the U.S. The path to war for Mexico was tragically similar to Brazil's. It was a matter of German submarine warfare in the Atlantic. In May 1942, two Mexican oil tankers, the Potrero del Llano and the Faja de Oro, were torpedoed and sunk by German U-boats in the Gulf of Mexico. The attacks sparked national outrage. Despite diplomatic protests, Germany refused to apologize or offer compensation. A few days later, more ships were sunk. Mexico had its casus belli. On May 22, 1942, Mexico declared war on the Axis powers. For the next 2 years, Mexico's contribution was primarily economic and strategic. The country signed agreements to supply the United States with critical war materials, most notably oil and minerals like zinc and copper. It also implemented the Bracero program in 1942, a massive guest worker program that sent hundreds of thousands of Mexican agricultural laborers to the United States. This program was essential for American agriculture, which faced severe labor shortages as its own citizens went to war. In effect, Mexican workers helped feed the Allied war effort, but President Camacho wanted Mexico to have a more direct military role. He believed it was a matter of national honor and a way to secure a stronger position for Mexico in the post-war world. The decision was made to form an elite air unit to fight alongside the Allies. This unit became the Squadron 201, better known as the Aztec Eagles. The squadron was composed of about 300 volunteers from the Mexican Army and Air Force, including pilots, mechanics, and support staff. They were sent to the United States for intensive training in Texas. They learned to fly the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, a powerful and rugged fighter bomber. After completing their training, the Aztec Eagles were assigned to the U.S. 5th Air Force and shipped out to the Pacific Theater. They arrived in the Philippines in March 1945. Their mission was to support the U.S. 25th Infantry Division in the final push to liberate the island of Luzon from Japanese forces. They flew ground support missions, bombing and strafing enemy positions, vehicles, and supply depots. They also flew escort missions for bombers and conducted reconnaissance flights. The squadron flew over 90 combat missions in the last few months of the war. They performed well, earning praise from American commanders. General Douglas MacArthur himself acknowledged their contribution. Their role was not decisive in the grand scheme of the Pacific War, but it was highly symbolic. As detailed by scholars like John P. Schmall, the participation of the Squadron 201 was a powerful statement of solidarity and a source of immense national pride. They were the only Mexican military unit to see combat outside the country's borders. When they returned to Mexico City after the war, they were greeted as heroes. Mexico's involvement solidified its relationship with the United States for a generation. It also secured Mexico a founding seat in the United Nations. The story of the Aztec Eagles is a reminder that the war in the Pacific was not just an American affair, but a multinational effort that included contributions from unlikely allies. Were there secret negotiations about post-war oil rights that influenced Mexico's decision to send a military unit into combat? What was the full extent of Axis espionage operations in Mexico City, a known hub for spies from all sides? How did the experience of the Aztec Eagles, training and fighting alongside Americans, change their own perceptions of their northern neighbor and influence Mexican military doctrine for decades to come? Number 17 was a neutral South American nation, a secret ally to the Axis. Argentina's role during the Second World War is one of the most controversial and complex of any nation. While most of Latin America eventually sided with the Allies, Argentina remained officially neutral until the final months of the war. This neutrality, however, was far from impartial. For much of the conflict, the Argentine government was sympathetic to the Axis powers, creating a hub of espionage and a safe haven for European capital in the Western Hemisphere. The reasons for this pro-Axis tilt were varied. Argentina had a large and influential community of German immigrants. The military, which held significant power in Argentine politics, admired the discipline and structure of the German army. There was also a strong sense of economic rivalry and political distrust toward the United States and Great Britain. Many Argentine leaders saw the war as a European conflict and believed that maintaining neutrality was the best way to protect their national interests. This policy was put into practice by a series of governments, most notably the military regime that took power in a coup in 1943. This government, which included the future leader Juan Perón, was openly nationalist and maintained close ties with Germany. While the rest of the hemisphere was breaking off relations, Argentina continued to allow German diplomats and agents to operate freely. Buenos Aires became a hotbed of espionage. The German embassy was the center of a vast intelligence network that spread throughout South America. As documented in the book, The Real Odessa by Ukigoni, this network was involved in everything from spying on Allied shipping to spreading propaganda. German agents used Argentina as a base to try and foment pro-Axis sentiment in neighboring countries. They also set up clandestine radio stations to communicate with Berlin. The Allies, particularly the United States, were deeply concerned. They saw Argentina as a security threat in their own backyard. The U.S. government put immense pressure on Argentina, imposing economic sanctions and a diplomatic blockade. Secretary of State Cordell Hull publicly denounced the Argentine government for its ties to the Axis. Argentina's neutrality also had a significant economic dimension. While Allied pressure limited some trade, the country benefited from selling its agricultural products, particularly beef and grain, to both sides of the conflict when possible, though the British naval blockade severely restricted trade with continental Europe. This wartime trade brought a great deal of wealth into the country. Banks in Buenos Aires also became a safe place for capital from all over Europe, with some historians arguing that funds from German-occupied territories were funneled through Argentine institutions. As the war turned decisively in favor of the Allies, the pressure on Argentina became unbearable. The country was increasingly isolated. Finally, in March 1945, with the war in Europe in its final weeks, Argentina declared war on Germany and Japan. The move was largely symbolic, a last-minute attempt to secure a place in the post-war international order and be included in the founding of the United Nations. After the war, the controversy continued. Argentina became a primary destination for former officials and collaborators from Axis-controlled Europe. The Perón government was accused of actively helping these individuals escape justice, providing them with travel documents and safe passage. This legacy has long cast a shadow over Argentina's wartime history. What is the full documented amount of Axis-linked capital that flowed into Argentine banks between 1939 and 1945, and where did it all end up? How many specific Allied ship movements were compromised by intelligence gathered by spies operating out of Buenos Aires? Were there any secret plans for a German-backed coup in a neighboring country that were orchestrated from Argentine soil but never came to fruition? Number 16, could a small Caribbean nation have tipped the scales in the Atlantic? Colombia's involvement in the war is a little-known story about naval skirmishes in the Caribbean and the strategic importance of geography. Like many Latin American nations, Colombia was officially neutral when the war began in Europe. President Eduardo Santos was determined to keep his country out of the conflict. However, Colombia's location was strategically vital. It had coastlines on both the Atlantic Caribbean Sea and the Pacific, and it sat astride the Panama Canal, one of the most critical choke points in the world for the Allies. The United States was acutely aware of the canal's vulnerability. Securing the Caribbean and the approaches to the canal was a top priority. German U-boats were already beginning to operate in these waters, threatening shipping lanes. Washington began to quietly cooperate with the Colombian government on defense matters. A significant point of concern for both Colombia and the U.S. was the large German immigrant population in the country. Some of these immigrants were suspected of being active agents or sympathizers of the government in Berlin. A major scare involved Scata, Colombia's national airline. It was founded by German expatriates in 1919, and many of its pilots and technicians were German. The fear was that these pilots could, in theory, use their planes to attack the Panama Canal. Under pressure from the United States, the Colombian government nationalized the airline in 1940, merging it into a new company, Avianca, and removing the German personnel. The direct entry of Colombia into the conflict was, once again, triggered by German submarine attacks. On June 23, 1942, the schooner Resolute was sunk by a U-boat. The attack was small, but it was an act of aggression against a Colombian vessel. This and other sinkings pushed public opinion and the government towards the Allies. Colombia broke diplomatic relations with the Axis powers in 1942 and officially declared a state of belligerency against Germany in November 1943. This was short of a full declaration of war, but allowed Colombia to take military action. Colombia did not send an expeditionary force overseas. Its contribution was primarily defensive and strategic. The Colombian Navy was small, but it was tasked with patrolling the country's Caribbean coastline. Its job was to hunt for German U-boats and protect Allied shipping. The Navy had a few destroyers, gunboats, and coastal patrol craft. The most famous naval engagement involving Colombia occurred on March 29, 1944. The Colombian destroyer ARC Caldas was on patrol when it detected a U-boat on the surface. The Caldas opened fire with its main guns and dropped depth charges. The crew reported seeing evidence of a direct hit and subsequent debris. For years, it was believed that the Caldas had sunk the U-boat U-154. However, post-war naval records from Germany, analyzed by historians like Alberto Borda, indicate that U-154 was not sunk that day and was in fact sunk later by U.S. destroyers. The Caldas had likely engaged and damaged the submarine, forcing it to retreat. It was a brief, inconclusive fight, but it was a moment of direct combat between Colombia and the German military. And Colombia's main role was providing access and support. It allowed the United States to establish radar stations and naval bases on its territory. These installations were crucial for anti-submarine warfare in the Caribbean. By securing its own maritime backyard, Colombia helped protect the vital shipping lanes that supplied the war effort and defended the southern approach to the Panama Canal. What was the true extent of the German intelligence network operating within Colombia, and were there any concrete plans to sabotage the Panama Canal? How much internal political debate occurred within the Colombian government about the risks and benefits of siding so openly with the United States? Were there other unrecorded encounters between the Colombian Navy and German U-boats in the Caribbean that were never officially confirmed? Number 15. Why did a neutral island nation become a battleground for spies? Ireland's position during the Second World War was unique and complex. The country, then officially known as Éire, declared itself neutral. This policy was pursued steadfastly by the Taoiseach Prime Minister Eamon de Valera. The decision was rooted in Ireland's long and difficult history with Great Britain. After centuries of British rule and a war for independence, the desire to assert Irish sovereignty and stay out of a British war was overwhelming. This neutrality was a powerful symbol of independence. However, neutrality did not mean isolation. Ireland became an intelligence battleground, a quiet backwater where spies from all sides operated. The British, Germans, and Americans were all active in Dublin. The Germans hoped to use Ireland as a backdoor to Britain, a place to gather intelligence and potentially support the Irish Republican Army IRA in acts of sabotage against British targets. German intelligence, the Abwehr, launched several operations to land agents in Ireland. Most of these were failures. The agents were often poorly prepared and quickly rounded up by Irish authorities. The most famous of these was Operation Lobster I, in which an agent named Hermann Gortz parachuted into Ireland in 1940. He remained at large for over a year before being captured. The British had a significant intelligence presence, centered at their legation in Dublin. They worked closely, though unofficially, with Irish military intelligence G2. This cooperation is a key part of the story. While de Valera was publicly adamant about neutrality, his government privately shared a great deal of intelligence with the Allies. As detailed by historians like Robert Fisk in his book In Time of War, this was a pragmatic, benevolent neutrality. The Irish government provided the Allies with detailed weather reports from the Atlantic. These reports were critical for planning military operations, including the D-Day landings. And Irish authorities also quietly repatriated any downed Allied airmen, allowing them to return to the fight. In contrast, downed German airmen were interned in Ireland for the duration of the war. The strategic importance of Ireland was not lost on the Allies. Winston Churchill was deeply frustrated by Irish neutrality, particularly by Dublin's refusal to allow the Royal Navy to use the treaty ports, 3 deep water harbors on the Irish coast. He believed access to these ports would have been invaluable in the Battle of the Atlantic against the U-boats. The pressure on Ireland to join the war, or at least grant access to the ports, was immense, but de Valera never wavered. Economically, Ireland was heavily dependent on Great Britain, and this trade continued throughout the war, providing essential food supplies to the British population. Tens of thousands of Irish citizens also chose to leave neutral Ireland and enlist in the British Armed Forces, a contribution that was personal and unofficial but significant nonetheless. De Valera's policy of neutrality was controversial then and remains so today. His decision to offer official condolences to the German ambassador upon the death of the German leader in 1945 caused an international uproar. Yet, for most people in Ireland, neutrality was the only acceptable course of action, a policy that kept the country out of the direct line of fire. It was a complex balancing act, tilting towards the Allies in secret while maintaining a rigid public facade of impartiality. How deep did the secret intelligence sharing between Dublin and London actually go? And what specific military operations were altered or made possible by Irish information? Were there high-level figures within the Irish government who actively argued for joining the Allies, and how were they silenced? What was the full story of German attempts to collaborate with the IRA, and how close did they come to orchestrating a major sabotage campaign in Britain? Number 14, how did a commitment to peace fuel a war machine? Sweden, like Ireland, was a neutral nation, but its neutrality was of a very different character. Sweden's geographic position made it impossible to ignore. It was bordered by German-occupied Norway and Denmark, and by Finland, which was co-belligerent with Germany against the Soviet Union. Sweden was surrounded. Its neutrality was not based on ideology or post-colonial assertion, but on pure pragmatism and survival. The most critical aspect of Sweden's wartime role was economic. Sweden was a major producer of high-grade iron ore. This iron ore was absolutely essential for the German steel industry, which in turn produced the tanks, guns, and ships for the German war machine. Throughout the war, a steady stream of Swedish iron ore flowed south to Germany. This trade is one of the most debated aspects of Sweden's history. The Allies were furious about it. They put immense diplomatic pressure on Sweden to stop the exports. They tried to buy up the ore themselves, and even made plans for potential military intervention in northern Sweden early in the war. But the Swedish government, led by Per Albin Hansson, felt it had no choice. Germany was its biggest trading partner and a powerful, threatening neighbor. Cutting off the iron ore would have almost certainly triggered a German invasion. For Sweden, the trade was a price for peace. As documented in studies on wartime economics, like the work of Erik Golson, this trade was a lifeline for the German armaments industry. Sweden's neutrality also required concessions in other areas. The government allowed German troops and war materials to be transported on Swedish railways between Norway and Finland. This permit in traffic was a clear violation of neutrality, but again, it was a concession made under duress to avoid invasion. But the story is not one-sided. Sweden also played a significant humanitarian role. It became a refuge for thousands of people fleeing persecution, particularly Jews from Denmark and Norway. In a famous episode in 1943, the Danish resistance, with the tacit approval of many Danish officials, organized a mass evacuation of Denmark's Jewish population to Sweden, saving thousands of lives. Swedish diplomats also took heroic actions. Raoul Wallenberg, a Swedish diplomat in Budapest, Hungary, used his official position to save tens of thousands of Hungarian Jews from being sent to concentration camps. He issued protective passports and established safe houses under the protection of the Swedish legation. His work is one of the most celebrated examples of individual courage during the war. Sweden was also a hive of intelligence activity. The Swedish intelligence services were highly effective. They famously broke and read German teleprinter traffic that was routed through Sweden to Finland and Norway. This intelligence, codenamed Operation Stella Polaris, was selectively shared with the Allies, providing them with valuable insights into German military plans. In Sweden's neutrality was a constant high-stakes balancing act. The government made compromises with Germany to maintain its sovereignty, while also secretly aiding the Allies and providing a safe haven for refugees. It was a policy of survival that proved successful in keeping Sweden out of the war, but it came at a moral cost that is still debated in the country today. What specific German military campaigns were directly and demonstrably impacted by the intelligence the Allies received from the Swedish codebreakers? How much of the profits from the iron ore trade with Germany shaped the post-war Swedish economy? Were there secret high-level agreements between the Swedish government and Germany about post-war spheres of influence in Scandinavia if the Axis had won? Number 13, did a dictator's choices inadvertently save the Allies? Spain, under the rule of General Francisco Franco, was another officially neutral country with strong sympathies for the Axis powers. Franco had come to power after the Spanish Civil War, 1936 to 1939, a conflict in which he received substantial military support from both Germany and Italy. He owed them a debt, and his own political ideology was closely aligned with theirs. Many expected Spain to officially join the Axis and enter the war. In the early years of the war, when the Axis seemed invincible, Franco's Spain moved from neutrality to a status of non-belligerence. This was a step closer to joining the war. Spain provided Germany with intelligence, access to its ports for submarines and supply ships, and critical raw materials, most notably tungsten, also known as wolfram, which was essential for hardening steel for armor-piercing shells. The battle for control of Spanish tungsten became a major economic front of the war, with the Allies trying to outbid the Germans and buy up all the available supply to deny it to them. And Franco also sent a military force to fight alongside the Germans, but in a way that preserved Spain's official non-belligerence. This was the Blue Division, Division Azul, a unit of around 18,000 Spanish volunteers. They were sent to fight against the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front. By sending volunteers, Franco could support his German allies without formally declaring war on the Western Allies. The Blue Division fought in some of the harshest conditions of the war, particularly around Leningrad, and suffered heavy casualties. The crucial moment for Spain came in 1940. After the fall of France, the German leadership met with Franco at Hendaye on the French-Spanish border. The Germans wanted Spain to enter the war and help them capture Gibraltar, the British fortress at the mouth of the Mediterranean. The capture of Gibraltar would have closed the Mediterranean to the Royal Navy and dramatically altered the course of the war in North Africa and the Middle East. But Franco's price was high. He demanded large amounts of food, fuel, and modern military equipment, which Germany was unwilling or unable to provide. He also demanded control over French colonies in North Africa, a move that would have alienated the collaborationist French government. The negotiations failed. Franco, the pragmatist, realized that Spain, exhausted and impoverished after its own civil war, was in no condition to enter another major conflict. The historian Paul Preston, in his biography of Franco, argues that Franco's decision was based on self-preservation, not a lack of will. This decision had enormous consequences. By staying out of the war, Spain ensured that Gibraltar remained in British hands. Gibraltar was the linchpin of the Allied position in the Mediterranean. It was the main supply base for the island of Malta and was the staging ground for Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa in 1942. If Spain had joined the Axis and Gibraltar had fallen, Operation Torch would have been impossible, and the entire Allied strategy for the war would have had to be rewritten. Franco's selfish, pragmatic decision inadvertently handed the Allies a major strategic victory. As the tide of war turned against the Axis, Franco skillfully distanced himself from his former allies. He withdrew the Blue Division from the Eastern Front in 1943 and shifted back to a position of true neutrality, eventually cutting off tungsten supplies to Germany under intense Allied pressure. were there German special forces units already on Spanish soil in 1940, ready to launch a surprise attack on Gibraltar if Franco had given the green light. How much Allied gold and cash was secretly paid to Spanish generals to persuade them to advise Franco against joining the war? What was the full extent of the German U-boat support network operating out of Spanish ports, and how many Allied ships were sunk because of it? Number 12, how did an old alliance shape a secretive neutrality? Near Portugal, like its neighbor Spain, was a neutral dictatorship during the war led by Antonio de Oliveira Salazar. But Portugal's neutrality was different from Spain's. It was shaped by the Anglo-Portuguese alliance, the oldest continuous diplomatic alliance in the world, dating back to 1373. This ancient treaty put Portugal in a very delicate position. On one hand, Salazar's Estado Novo regime had ideological similarities with the Axis powers. On the other hand, Portugal's economy was heavily dependent on trade with Britain and its colonies, and the long-standing alliance with Britain could not be easily ignored. Portugal was caught in the middle. Like Spain, Portugal was a crucial source of tungsten. The mines at Penasqueira were among the most important in Europe. A fierce economic war was fought over Portuguese tungsten, with British and American agents competing with German buyers, driving the price up to astronomical levels. For much of the war, Salazar's government skillfully played both sides, selling the vital mineral to both the Allies and the Axis, bringing a fortune into the state's coffers. This strategy is detailed in works like Salazar's War by the historian Neil Lockery. Portugal's other major strategic asset was the Azores, a group of islands in the middle of the Atlantic. The Azores were in the perfect location for an air and naval base to control the central Atlantic, a crucial area in the battle against the U-boats known as the Black Pit, where Allied aircraft could not provide cover for convoys. For years, both Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt pressured Salazar to grant the Allies basing rights on the islands. Churchill even drew up plans for a military seizure of the Azores if Portugal refused. Salazar resisted for as long as he could, fearing a German retaliatory attack on mainland Portugal. He did not want to turn his country into a battlefield. However, by 1943, the tide of the war had clearly turned. The Allies were on the offensive. Salazar, a shrewd political survivor, realized that it was time to tilt his neutrality in favor of the Allies. In August 1943, he agreed to lease them bases in the Azores. This was a pivotal moment in the Battle of the Atlantic. The new airbase at Lagans Field allowed Allied long-range patrol bombers to cover the Black Pit, effectively closing the mid-Atlantic gap. From the Azores, they could hunt U-boats and protect convoys traveling between the United States and Britain. The impact was immediate and significant. The number of ships sunk by U-boats in the central Atlantic dropped dramatically. The bases in the Azores are considered by many naval historians to have been a key factor in the final victory over the U-boat menace. Lisbon, the capital, was also a unique feature of the war. As one of the few neutral capitals with open air links to both Britain and the continent, it became the undisputed capital of espionage in Europe. Spies, refugees, diplomats, and businessmen from all sides mingled in the hotels and cafes of Lisbon. It was a city of intrigue where secrets were bought and sold, and escape routes to the Americas were planned. What was the final tally of tungsten sold to Germany versus the Allies, and how did this trade directly affect the production of armaments on both sides? Were there secret discussions within the British government about fomenting a coup against Salazar if he continued to refuse access to the Azores? How many high-level Allied and Axis intelligence operations were either successful or compromised because of agents operating in the open city of Lisbon? Number 11. Could a bridge between continents have changed the war's course? Turkey's position in the Second World War was one of the most strategically precarious of any nation. It controlled the Bosphorus and Dardanelles Straits, the only maritime passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. It bordered Axis-controlled Greece and Bulgaria to the west, the Soviet Union to the east, and British-controlled Syria and Iraq to the south. Turkey was, as its president Ismet İnönü knew all too well, surrounded by the war. İnönü's overriding goal was to keep his country out of the fighting. He had seen the collapse of the Ottoman Empire after the First World War and was determined not to repeat that disaster. He pursued a policy of active neutrality, a difficult and dangerous balancing act of placating both the Axis and the Allies to avoid being drawn into the conflict. In the early years of the war, Germany was the dominant power in the region. Turkey signed a non-aggression pact with Germany in 1941, a move that shocked the Allies. Economically, Turkey was an important trading partner for Germany. It supplied the German war machine with chromite, or chrome ore, a mineral vital for producing stainless steel, used in everything from submarine parts to aircraft engines. As with tungsten from Spain and Portugal, the Allies engaged in a campaign of preclusive buying, purchasing Turkish chrome at inflated prices simply to keep it out of German hands. Winston Churchill was obsessed with bringing Turkey into the war on the Allied side. He met with President Inonu several times, including at the Adana Conference in 1943. Churchill believed that if Turkey joined the Allies, it could open a new front against Germany in the Balkans and provide a direct supply route to the Soviet Union through the Straits. He promised large amounts of military aid, but Inonu consistently refused. The Turkish army was large but poorly equipped. Inonu feared that if Turkey entered the war, it would be quickly overrun by the German army before Allied aid could make a difference. He also harbored a deep historical distrust of the Soviet Union and was wary of any alliance that would strengthen his powerful northern neighbor. His refusal to join the war was a major strategic frustration for Churchill. While officially neutral, Turkey did allow certain activities that benefited the Allies. Istanbul, like Lisbon, became a center for espionage. The city's location made it a perfect listening post for gathering intelligence on the Balkans and the German war effort in the East. One of the most famous spy stories of the war involves Ilyas Abazna, an Albanian, working as a valet to the British ambassador in Ankara. A code named Cicero by the Germans. He photographed top-secret British documents and sold them to the German embassy. However, as detailed in books about the affair, German intelligence largely distrusted the information, believing it was too good to be true, and failed to act on much of it. As the war progressed and Germany's defeat became inevitable, Turkey began to shift its position. It stopped its chrome exports to Germany in 1944 under intense Allied pressure. Finally, in February 1945, Turkey declared war on Germany and Japan. Like Argentina's declaration, this was a largely symbolic act, done to ensure that Turkey would be a founding member of the United Nations. Inonu's cautious and patient diplomacy had successfully navigated his country through the war without a single Turkish soldier having to fire a shot in anger. If Turkey had joined the Allies in 1943, could it have shortened the war in Europe, or would it have simply created a disastrous new front? What was the real value of the intelligence sold by the spy Cicero? And what specific German decisions were influenced or not influenced by it? Were there secret protocols in the 1941 German-Turkish non-aggression pact that outlined a plan for joint military action against the Soviet Union under certain conditions? Number 10, why was a neutral nation invaded by both sides? Iran's experience in the Second World War is a stark example of how a country's strategic location can override its declared neutrality. In Iran, then known as Persia, was ruled by Reza Shah Pahlavi. When the war broke out, he declared his country neutral. His primary concern was to maintain Iran's independence from the two great powers that had historically dominated it, Great Britain and Russia, and now the Soviet Union. Reza Shah had also fostered close economic ties with Germany in the 1930s. He saw Germany as a third power that could help balance British and Soviet influence. As a result, by 1941, there were several thousand German nationals in Iran working as engineers, technicians, and advisors. This situation became intolerable for the Allies after Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941. The Allies desperately needed a secure supply route to get war materials to the beleaguered Soviets. The sea route to the northern ports of Murmansk and Archangel was treacherous and under constant attack by German U-boats and aircraft. The route through the Pacific to Vladivostok was long and limited by a neutrality pact between Japan and the USSR. And Iran offered the perfect alternative. It provided a land route, the Persian Corridor, through which trucks and trains could carry supplies from the Persian Gulf to the Soviet border. The Trans-Iranian Railway, which Reza Shah had built as a symbol of national modernization, was suddenly a vital strategic asset for the Allies. The British and Soviets were also deeply concerned about the large German presence in Iran. They feared that the German nationals could act as a fifth column, sabotaging oil fields or encouraging a pro-Axis coup. They demanded that Reza Shah expel all German citizens. When he hesitated, citing his country's neutrality, the Allies decided to act. In August 1941, British and Soviet forces launched a coordinated invasion of Iran from the south and north. The Iranian army, small and outmatched, offered little resistance and was quickly defeated. The invasion was a clear violation of international law and Iranian sovereignty. Reza Shah was forced to abdicate in favor of his young son Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. The new government had no choice but to cooperate with the Allies. Iran was effectively occupied for the rest of the war. The Persian corridor became one of the main arteries of the Allied war effort. Over 5 million tons of supplies, including thousands of tanks, aircraft, and trucks, were transported through Iran to the Soviet Union. This aid was crucial, particularly in the dark days of 1942 and 1943, when the Soviets were fighting for their survival. As documented by historian T.H. Vale Motter in the official U.S. Army history of the Persian corridor, the logistical effort was monumental. The occupation had a profound impact on Iran. The presence of tens of thousands of foreign troops caused massive social and economic disruption, including food shortages and rampant inflation. It also set the stage for future political instability. However, Iran's strategic importance was cemented in November 1943, when Tehran was chosen as the site for the first face-to-face meeting between the three main Allied leaders, Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin. The Tehran Conference was where they planned the final stages of the war, including the D-Day landings. How many German agents were actually operating in Iran in 1941? And did they have a concrete plan to stage a coup or sabotage Allied interests? What was the full economic and social cost to the Iranian people of the Allied occupation and the massive logistical operation of the Persian corridor? Were there secret agreements made at the Tehran Conference about the post-war fate of Iran that directly led to the political tensions of the Cold War? Number 9, what happened when a pro-Axis coup unfolded on Britain's doorstep? Iraq, like Iran, was technically an independent nation, but was still heavily under British influence. The Anglo-Iraqi Treaty of 1930 granted Britain the right to maintain military bases in the country. Iraq was strategically vital to the British Empire. It was a major oil producer, and it sat on the overland route to India. As the war progressed, anti-British sentiment in Iraq grew, fueled by Arab nationalism and pro-German propaganda. A powerful group of Iraqi politicians and army officers, known as the Golden Square, saw the war as an opportunity to finally throw off British influence. They were led by the nationalist politician Rashid Ali al-Gailani. In April 1941, the Golden Square launched a coup d'etat. They overthrew the pro-British regent and installed Rashid Ali as the head of a new government. This new government immediately began to challenge the British position in the country and made overtures to the Axis powers, seeking military and financial support. This was a direct threat to the British war effort. The Royal Air Force base at Habbaniyah in central Iraq became a flashpoint. The new Iraqi government demanded that the British cease all troop movements and flights from the base. When the British refused, the Iraqi army surrounded Habbaniyah and began a siege. The situation was desperate. The base was defended by a small force, mostly training personnel with a collection of obsolete aircraft. The British response was swift. A relief force was dispatched from British-controlled Palestine and Transjordan. The small air force at Habbaniyah, despite being outmatched, went on the offensive, bombing the Iraqi positions. The conflict that followed is known as the Anglo-Iraqi War. It lasted for about a month in May 1941. Germany and Italy tried to support the Iraqi rebels. The German military sent a small number of aircraft flying with Iraqi markings to operate out of Mosul in northern Iraq. They also sent an intelligence mission led by Fritz Grobe, a key figure in German efforts to stir up anti-British sentiment in the Middle East. However, the Axis support was too little, too late. The British ground forces relieved the siege of Habbaniyah and advanced on Baghdad. By the end of May, the Rashid Ali government had collapsed and its leaders had fled the country. The pro-British monarchy was restored. The Anglo-Iraqi War was a short but crucial conflict. A victory for the pro-Axis government in Iraq would have been a disaster for the Allies. It would have cut off a major source of oil and threatened the British position in the entire Middle East. It could have also provided the Germans with a springboard for advancing further, potentially linking up with their forces in North Africa or driving towards the Soviet Caucasus. The swift British victory secured a vital flank and ensured that Iraqi oil would continue to flow to the Allies for the remainder of the war. Iraq formally declared war on the Axis in 1943. How close did the German and Italian air forces come to establishing a major airbase in Iraq that could have threatened British shipping and forces in the region? What were the specific promises of military aid and post-war independence made by German envoys to Rashid Ali's government? Were there any plans for a coordinated uprising in British-controlled Palestine to coincide with the Iraqi coup? Number 8, how did a desert kingdom become a wartime crossroads? Egypt was officially an independent kingdom, but like Iraq, it was tied to Britain by a treaty that allowed the British military to station troops on its soil to protect the Suez Canal. The canal was the lifeline of the British Empire, the shortest sea route between Britain and India, Australia, and the oil fields of the Persian Gulf. Its defense was a non-negotiable priority for the Allies. When the war began, Egypt declared itself a non-belligerent, but its fate was inextricably linked to the Allied cause. The country became the main base of operations for the British Army in the Middle East and North Africa. And Cairo became a massive military headquarters, and Alexandria was the main base for the Royal Navy's Mediterranean fleet. The war came to Egypt in 1940 when Italian forces based in neighboring Libya invaded. This began the long and bloody North African campaign, which was fought almost entirely on Egyptian and Libyan soil. For the next 2 years, the desert west of Alexandria became a battlefield for a seesaw war between the British Commonwealth forces and the German and Italian armies of the Axis. The Egyptian government and people were in a difficult position. Many Egyptians were resentful of the continued British presence in their country, and some saw the Axis powers as potential liberators. There was a great deal of sympathy for the German cause among certain nationalist groups. The Egyptian army itself was kept out of the main fighting, largely because the British did not fully trust its loyalty. The climax of the war in Egypt came in 1942. The German Afrika Korps, led by one of its most famous commanders, had driven the British back deep into Egypt. They were only a few dozen miles from Alexandria. The situation was critical. If the Axis captured Alexandria and the Suez Canal, they would sever the British Empire's main artery and gain access to the oil fields of the Middle East. It could have been a war-losing blow for the Allies. The British made their stand at a small, insignificant railway stop in the desert called El Alamein. The two battles of El Alamein, fought in the summer and autumn of 1942, were the turning point of the North African campaign. The first battle halted the German advance. The second, a massive offensive launched by the British Eighth Army under General Bernard Montgomery, decisively defeated the Axis forces and sent them into a retreat from which they would never recover. While the Egyptian army did not fight in these battles, Egypt's contribution was immense. Its ports, railways, and airfields were the logistical backbone of the entire Allied campaign. Egyptian workers provided essential labor. The country absorbed the impact of having hundreds of thousands of foreign soldiers on its soil. The war transformed Egyptian society and economy. After the victory at El Alamein, Egypt was secure, but it remained a vital rear base for the Allies for the rest of the war, supporting the invasions of Sicily and Italy. Egypt's reluctant but essential role as a host and a platform for the Allied military was a key factor in the victory in the Mediterranean theater. How deep did pro-German sentiment run within the Egyptian officer corps? And was there ever a credible plan for a military coup to support an Axis breakthrough? What was the full, unquantified economic cost to Egypt of hosting the massive British military presence and the resulting inflation and shortages? Were there any secret back-channel communications between the Egyptian palace and German agents during the critical days before the Battle of El Alamein? Number 7, did gold in geography outweigh a nation's army? South Africa's entry into the Second World War was a moment of high political drama. When Britain declared war on Germany in September 1939, the Prime Minister of South Africa, JBM Hertzog, wanted the country to remain neutral. He argued that it was a European conflict that had nothing to do with South Africa. However, another powerful figure in his own cabinet, Jan Smuts, argued passionately that South Africa had a duty to stand with Britain and the Commonwealth. The issue was put to a vote in the South African Parliament. In a tense session, Smuts's faction won by a narrow margin of 13 votes. Herzog resigned, and Smuts became the new prime minister, immediately leading South Africa into the war on the side of the Allies. The decision was divisive. A significant portion of the Afrikaner population, which had fought against the British in the Boer War only a few decades earlier, had strong anti-British and in some cases pro-German sympathies. There were organizations like the Squadron that actively opposed the war effort and engaged in acts of sabotage. Despite this internal division, South Africa made a significant military contribution to the Allied cause. The South African Army fought in several major campaigns. Their first major involvement was in the East African Campaign, where they played a key role in defeating the Italian forces in Ethiopia and liberating the country. South African soldiers then moved to the North African Campaign, where they fought alongside other Commonwealth forces. They suffered a major disaster in 1942, when the entire 2nd South African Infantry Division was captured at the Fall of Tobruk in Libya. Despite this setback, South African forces, including the South African Air Force, continued to fight with distinction, participating in the pivotal Battle of El Alamein. After the victory in North Africa, the 6th South African Armored Division was formed and sent to Italy, where it fought its way up the Italian peninsula as part of the U.S. Fifth Army. But perhaps South Africa's most important contribution was not military but economic and strategic. First, its geography was vital. The naval base at Simonstown near Cape Town was a critical asset for the Royal Navy. After the Mediterranean was effectively closed to Allied shipping in the middle of the war, the sea route around the Cape of Good Hope became the main supply line to the Middle East and India. South African ports were essential for repairing and refueling the thousands of ships that used this route. Second, and most importantly, South Africa was the world's largest producer of gold. In an era when international transactions were still heavily based on gold, this was an immense asset. South African gold helped the British government pay for war materials, particularly from the United States, before the Lend-Lease Act was passed. The stability that South African gold provided to the Allied financial system was a quiet but crucial factor in the war effort. The research of economists like GDT de Kock has highlighted the importance of this financial contribution. What was the full extent of the sabotage and intelligence gathering carried out by pro-German groups within South Africa, and how close did they come to disrupting the war effort? How much did the wartime experience of black South African soldiers, who served mostly in non-combat roles but were exposed to different societies, contribute to the rise of anti-apartheid activism after the war? Were there any secret Allied contingency plans to seize the South African gold mines if a pro-German government had come to power? Number 6. How did 500,000 horses help win a war? The Mongolian People's Republic is a country that almost never appears in standard histories of the Second World War in Europe. But this small, landlocked nation, situated between the Soviet Union and Japanese-controlled China, was a staunch and incredibly important ally to the Soviets. Its contribution was not in manpower on the European front, but in resources that were absolutely vital to the Soviet war effort. Mongolia's involvement really began before the war in Europe even started. In 1939, Japanese forces from Manchuria tested the Soviet and Mongolian defenses along their border at a river called the Khalkhin Gol. This resulted in a large, undeclared border war known as the Battles of Khalkhin Gol. A combined Soviet-Mongolian force under the command of a then unknown general named Georgy Zhukov inflicted a crushing defeat on the Japanese. This battle, meticulously analyzed by military historians like Stuart D. Goldman, had profound consequences. It convinced the Japanese army to abandon its northern expansion plans, Hokushin-ron, and turn its focus south towards Southeast Asia and the Pacific Nanshin-ron. This meant that Japan did not attack the Soviet Union in the Far East in 1941, when the Germans invaded from the west. This, in turn, allowed Stalin to transfer dozens of desperately needed, battle-hardened divisions from Siberia to defend Moscow in the winter of 1941, a move that was critical in saving the capital. The Mongolian stand at Khalkhin Gol had a direct, if indirect, impact on the war in Europe. Once the German-Soviet War began, Mongolia declared its full support for the USSR. It did not send troops to Europe, but it effectively put its entire economy at the service of the Soviet war machine. Mongolia was a pastoral nation, and its wealth was in its livestock. Throughout the war, Mongolia sent a massive amount of aid to the Soviet Union. This included huge quantities of meat, wool, and leather for winter uniforms, but its most important contribution was horses. In a war where, despite the images of tanks, much of the transport for both armies still relied on horsepower, the tough, resilient Mongolian horse was an invaluable asset. The Red Army lost millions of horses in the first year of the war. Mongolia provided them with nearly 500,000 trained horses, a contribution that was essential for keeping the Soviet artillery, supply wagons, and cavalry mobile. Mongolia also provided financial aid. The Mongolian people raised money to fund the Revolutionary Mongolia Tank Brigade and a fighter squadron, both of which were donated to the Red Army. This massive transfer of resources came at a huge cost to Mongolia itself. The country essentially gave away its entire economic surplus for 4 years, leading to severe shortages and rationing at home. It was an alliance born of necessity. Mongolia relied on the Soviet Union for its security against Japan, but the level of support provided was extraordinary. In August 1945, at the very end of the war, the Mongolian army joined the Soviets in their invasion of Japanese-occupied Manchuria, fulfilling its role as a military ally. What was the real impact of Mongolian resource depletion on its own population during the war years, a subject rarely studied outside of Mongolia? Were there any secret communications between Mongolian leaders and China's nationalist government about a potential post-war realignment? How much did the shared experience of the Khalkhin-Gol battles shape the personal relationship between the Soviet general Zhukov and the Mongolian leader Khorloogiin Choibalsan? And how did that influence the level of wartime aid? Number 5. Why did an independent kingdom ally itself with an invading empire? Thailand's story in the war is a complex tale of pragmatism, nationalism, and survival. Unlike other countries in Southeast Asia that were colonies, Thailand, known as Siam until 1939, was an independent kingdom. When the war began, it declared neutrality. However, the government led by the military dictator Plak Phibun Songkhram, known as Phibun, was also strongly nationalistic. Phibun saw the turmoil of the war as an opportunity to reclaim territories that Thailand had lost to the French in Laos and Cambodia in the 19th century. In 1940, after the fall of France, Phibun took his chance. The Thai army invaded French Indochina, leading to the Franco-Thai War. Japan, the dominant power in the region, mediated a peace settlement that awarded the disputed territories to Thailand. This pushed Thailand closer into Japan's sphere of influence. The decisive moment came on December 8, 1941. Just hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces landed on the coast of Thailand. They demanded passage through the country to invade British Malaya and Burma. After a few hours of fierce but localized resistance, Phibun's government ordered a ceasefire. They had to make a choice, become a conquered territory or a junior partner. They chose the latter. On December 21st, 1941, Thailand signed a formal military alliance with Japan. In January 1942, it declared war on the United States and Great Britain. For the next few years, Thailand was an ally of Japan. The country became a crucial staging area and supply base for the Japanese military campaigns in Southeast Asia. The most famous project undertaken in Thailand during this period was the construction of the Thailand-Burma Railway. The railway was built to supply the Japanese army in Burma. It was constructed using the forced labor of tens of thousands of Allied prisoners of war and Asian laborers. The conditions were horrific, and the railway became known as the Death Railway. The story was later immortalized in the book and film The Bridge on the River Kwai. However, the alliance with Japan was never popular with the entire Thai population or its ruling elite. As the war began to turn against Japan, an anti-Japanese resistance movement emerged. This was the Free Thai movement. It was secretly supported by influential figures within the Thai government itself, including the regent Priti Banomyong. The Free Thai movement established contact with the American Intelligence Agency, the Office of Strategic Services, OSS. They provided intelligence to the Allies and prepared for a potential uprising against the Japanese. This duality is the key to understanding Thailand's wartime role. While the official government of Phibun was allied with Japan, a powerful shadow government was secretly working with the Allies. When Japan's defeat was imminent in 1945, the Free Thai movement was able to quickly take control. Because of the activities of the Free Thai movement, the United States did not treat Thailand as a defeated enemy after the war. Washington argued that the declaration of war had been made under duress. Thailand was forced to return the territories it had gained from France, but its sovereignty was preserved. Phibun's government had made a pragmatic choice to ally with Japan to avoid conquest, while the Free Thai movement provided a way out, allowing the country to navigate the treacherous currents of the war and emerge with its independence intact. How much did Prime Minister Phibun secretly know about the Free Thai movement, and was he tacitly allowing it to exist as an insurance policy? What was the full extent of the intelligence provided by the Free Thai agents to the OSS, and how did it affect Allied military operations in Burma and the Pacific? Were there any serious plans by the Japanese military to depose the Thai government and impose direct rule if they had discovered the full scope of the resistance movement? Number 4, did a forbidden kingdom hold the key to the roof of the world? In Tibet, the remote high-altitude kingdom in the Himalayas seems as far removed from the Second World War as any place on Earth. It was an isolated, neutral country, a theocracy led by a young Dalai Lama. Yet even here the global conflict intruded. Tibet's importance was not economic or military, but strategic and symbolic. It was the roof of the world, a geographic buffer between British India, China, and the Soviet Union. The main concern for the Allies, particularly the British, was the potential for German influence in this remote region. This fear was not entirely unfounded. In 1938 to 1939, a German scientific expedition led by Ernst Schaefer visited Tibet. The expedition had the official backing of the government in Berlin, while its stated purpose was to study the flora, fauna, and people of Tibet. There were also political and ideological motives. Some figures in the German leadership were interested in theories about the origins of the Aryan race in the Himalayas. The Schaefer expedition took extensive film footage and measurements and met with Tibetan officials. The British, who had long treated Tibet as part of their sphere of influence to protect the northern border of India, watched this German activity with deep suspicion. The idea of German agents establishing a foothold in Lhasa and potentially stirring up trouble was a major worry. Tibet's other point of contact with the war was through China. After the Japanese invasion of China in 1937, the Chinese government was cut off from most of its supply routes. One of the few remaining options was a difficult and dangerous overland route from India across the Himalayas through Tibet and into China. The Chinese government repeatedly pressured the Tibetan government in Lhasa to allow them to transport war materials along this route. The Tibetans, fiercely protective of their independence and neutrality, consistently refused. They did not want to be drawn into the Sino-Japanese War and feared that allowing Chinese troops or supplies to cross their territory would lead to a permanent Chinese presence. This refusal was a source of great frustration for the Chinese and their Western allies. There was also a strange and little-known episode involving the Austrian mountaineer Heinrich Harrer. Harrer was part of a German climbing expedition in British India when the war broke out. He was arrested by the British and sent to an internment camp. He eventually escaped and, along with his companion Peter Aufschneider, made a remarkable journey across the Himalayas, finally arriving in the forbidden city of Lhasa in 1944. Harrer remained in Tibet for 7 years, eventually becoming a friend and tutor to the young Dalai Lama. And his story, told in his book 7 Years in Tibet, provides a unique European perspective on this isolated kingdom during the final years of the war. Tibet's role in the war was ultimately a passive one. It successfully maintained its neutrality and isolation. But it was not untouched. The great power conflict swirled around it with British, German, and Chinese interests all vying for influence in a land that just wanted to be left alone. What were the real secret objectives of the 1938 German expedition to Tibet, and did they establish any lasting intelligence contacts? How much pressure did the U.S. and Britain put on the Tibetan government to open a supply route to China, and what incentives did they offer? Were there any other foreign agents or explorers besides Harrer and Aufschneider who secretly entered Tibet during the war years? Number 3, why did a tiny republic on a mountaintop declare war on a superpower? The most serene Republic of San Marino is one of the world's oldest and smallest countries. It is a microstate completely surrounded by Italy. When the Second World War began, San Marino, true to its long history, declared itself neutral. For the first few years of the war, this neutrality held. The small republic became a haven. It took in tens of thousands of refugees from the surrounding Italian countryside who were fleeing the fighting and the bombing. At one point, the number of refugees in San Marino was many times its native population of about 15,000. Providing food and shelter for over 100,000 people was an immense humanitarian effort for such a tiny state. The war arrived directly in San Marino in 1944. As the Allied forces fought their way up the Italian peninsula, the German army established a defensive position called the Gothic Line, which ran across northern Italy. San Marino found itself right on the edge of this heavily fortified line. Despite its neutrality, on June 26, 1944, San Marino was bombed by the British Royal Air Force. The bombing was a mistake, a tragic error based on faulty intelligence that suggested German forces were using the Republic's territory. The raid caused dozens of civilian casualties and significant damage. The British government later apologized for the bombing. The incident led to one of the most curious declarations of war in the entire conflict. In response to the bombing and the increasing German military presence on its borders, the government of San Marino, feeling its neutrality had been violated by both sides, declared war on Germany in September 1944. The idea of this tiny republic declaring war on the German state was almost surreal. San Marino's own armed forces were mostly ceremonial. Shortly after the declaration of war, the Battle of San Marino took place. German forces occupied the small republic to use its high ground for artillery observation posts. Allied forces, primarily British and Indian troops, attacked and, after a few days of heavy fighting, captured San Marino. The battle was brief but intense. After its liberation, San Marino was administered by the Allies for a short time before its own government was restored. The country's brief and largely unwilling entry into the war was over. Its primary role remained humanitarian, that of a small sanctuary in the middle of a massive conflict. The story of San Marino is a microcosm of the war's tragedy, showing how even the smallest and most peaceful of nations could not escape being caught up in the violence that swept across the continent. What was the specific piece of faulty intelligence that led the Royal Air Force to bomb a neutral state? How did the government of San Marino manage the logistics of caring for a refugee population that was more than 6 times its own citizenry? Were there any secret negotiations between San Marino's leaders and German commanders to try and keep the German army from occupying the Republic's territory? Number 2, how did a distant Arctic island become a linchpin of the war? And Iceland's Second World War experience was one of a peaceful but total transformation. When the war began, Iceland was a sovereign kingdom in a personal union with Denmark, meaning they shared the same king, but Iceland was fully independent in its governance. It declared strict neutrality. This neutrality was shattered in April 1940 when Germany occupied Denmark. The link between Iceland and its king was severed. The British were immediately concerned. They feared that Germany would try to seize Iceland next. The island's location in the North Atlantic was of immense strategic importance. If Germany established air and naval bases in Iceland, they could dominate the vital convoy routes between North America and Britain. The Uke Gap, Greenland, Iceland, UK, was the choke point through which the Royal Navy had to contain the German fleet. And occupied Iceland would blow a hole right through that strategy. The British government could not risk it. On May 10, 1940, they launched a surprise, peaceful invasion of Iceland, Operation Fork. A small force of Royal Marines landed in the capital, Reykjavik. The Icelandic government issued a formal protest at the violation of its neutrality, but instructed its people not to resist. There were no shots fired. The British occupation began a period of immense change for Iceland. The country had a small, homogeneous population of about 120,000 people. The arrival of tens of thousands of British and later Canadian soldiers was a huge cultural and economic shock. The construction of airfields, naval bases, and roads created an economic boom. Unemployment disappeared overnight. This period is known in Iceland as a standard, the situation. In 1941, the United States, still officially neutral at the time, made an agreement with Britain and Iceland. The American troops would take over the defense of Iceland, freeing up British forces for duty elsewhere. This was a significant step for the U.S., its first major military deployment into the European theater of operations. After the U.S. entered the war in December 1941, Iceland's role became even more critical. Iceland became a vital hub for the Allies in the Battle of the Atlantic. Its airfields were used by British and American long-range patrol aircraft that hunted for U-boats and protected the convoys. Its harbors sheltered naval vessels. The weather station in Iceland provided some of the most important meteorological data for the Allies, which was crucial for planning operations across Europe. The American presence had a lasting impact. The friendly occupation completely transformed the country, bringing in new money, technology, and culture. It also led to Iceland's final step toward full independence. With Denmark still under German occupation, the Icelanders held a referendum in 1944. They voted overwhelmingly to sever the union with Denmark and establish a republic. The modern Republic of Iceland was born in the middle of the war under the protection of the Allied military. What were the detailed German naval and air force plans for a potential invasion of Iceland in 1940, and how close did they come to being implemented? What was the true social and demographic impact of having a foreign military presence that at its peak was equivalent to half the native male population? Were there any secret agreements made between Roosevelt and Churchill about the long-term post-war use of military bases in Iceland even before the U.S. officially entered the war? Number one, who were the legendary soldiers from the mountains? Nepal was an independent kingdom isolated in the Himalayas. It was not a direct participant in the sense of being attacked or occupied. Its contribution was entirely in the form of manpower, specifically the legendary Gurkha soldiers. Nepal had a long-standing and unique relationship with the British Empire. Under a treaty signed in 1815, Britain had the right to recruit soldiers from the hill tribes of Nepal for service in the British Indian Army. These soldiers, known as Gurkhas, had earned a reputation as some of the finest and fiercest infantrymen in the world. Their motto, Kafarhunubanda Marnu Ramro, translates to better to die than be a coward. When the Second World War broke out, the King of Nepal offered the full support of his country to the Allied cause. The recruitment of Gurkhas was massively expanded. During the war, over 250,000 Gurkhas served in the British Army. They were organized into more than 40 battalions. This was a staggering contribution from a small, relatively poor country. Gurkha soldiers fought in almost every theater of the war. They fought in the deserts of North Africa, distinguishing themselves in battles like El Alamein. They fought in the mountains of Italy, where their natural aptitude for mountain warfare was invaluable, particularly at the brutal Battle of Monte Cassino. They fought in the jungles of Burma, which is perhaps where they made their most famous contribution. The Burma campaign was one of the toughest of the entire war, fought in incredibly difficult terrain and climate against a determined Japanese army. Gurkha battalions were at the heart of the British 14th Army, often called the Forgotten Army. They were experts at jungle warfare, known for their endurance, bravery, and skill with their trademark weapon, the hukuri, a forward-curving knife. They participated in crucial battles like Imphal and Kohima, which turned the tide against the Japanese in Southeast Asia. The Gurkhas' bravery was legendary. They earned thousands of gallantry awards, including the Victoria Cross, the highest award for valor in the British Commonwealth. The respect they commanded from both their allies and their enemies was immense. Field Marshal Sir William Slim, the commander of the 14th Army, wrote extensively about his admiration for their skill and courage in his memoirs, Defeat into Victory. Nepal's contribution was not without cost. The country's economy was heavily reliant on the wages sent home by the soldiers. But the human cost was high, with tens of thousands of Gurkhas killed or wounded. The war effort also put a strain on the country's agricultural workforce. Nepal itself was never threatened, but its people played a disproportionately large role in securing an Allied victory, particularly in the war in Asia. The story of the Gurkhas is a powerful example of how a nation's main contribution to the global conflict could be the character and courage of its people. What was the full economic impact on Nepal of having 250,000 of its young men serving in a foreign army for 6 years? How did the experiences of these soldiers who traveled the world and saw different societies change Nepalese politics and culture when they returned home? Were there any unrecorded instances of Gurkha units being deployed on secret, behind the lines missions with special operations forces that have never been declassified.